September 29th, 2025 morning, Bryansk, Russia. The flames of a factory stained the first light of dawn crimson. But this was no ordinary fire. This factory was the cruelest irony of war. In the corridors of that factory, the electronic brains of cruise missiles destined to strike Ukraine were being produced. And that morning, 4 Neptune missiles, returning for revenge, were launched from 240 kilometers away to hunt down their creators. Each Neptune missile was carrying a 150-kilogram high-explosive cluster warhead. As the sirens wailed, workers fleeing the burning facility realized that war was no longer just a distant nightmare watched on television. War had come to their own homes, their own workplace. The curtain rose on this strategically brilliant operation just one day earlier, on September 28th. That night, Russia had launched a barbaric attack targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure with approximately 600 UAVs and more than 40 missiles. Ukraine's response would be much more than a crude retaliation. It was a cleverly orchestrated chess move that lured the enemy into a trap. The first move in the art of war was made hundreds of kilometers away from the main target, in Belgorod. On the night of September 28th, American-made HIMARS missiles struck the Luch thermal power plant, the beating heart of the region. In an instant, Belgorod and its surroundings were plunged into pitch darkness. The power went out, water pumps stopped, the internet crashed, and complete chaos ensued in the city. This move caused complete panic among the Russian command. Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov's calls to the public to stay in your homes, and his admission that there may be glitches in the missile warning systems highlighted the seriousness of the situation. Russian generals and air defense commanders had turned all their attention and emergency resources to this crisis in the south, namely the darkness in Belgorod. Emergency crews, fire departments, and military units were struggling to cope with this unexpected disaster. But while they were focused on putting out the fire in the south, they were unaware that the real deadly blow was coming from elsewhere, from the north. They were trapped. The darkness in Belgorod created the perfect smokescreen for the deadly blow that would strike Bryansk. With all eyes on Belgorod, on the morning of September 29th, Ukraine made its second and final move. 4 Ukrainian-made Neptune cruise missiles set course for the heart of Russia. The target was the highly critical Elektrodetal factory in the Bryansk Oblast, adjacent to Belgorod. This factory was a center that produced most of the inter-block connections for Russia's most modern cruise and ballistic missiles, including hypersonic missiles such as the Kinzhal, meaning it manufactured the missile's electronic brains. This was no ordinary missile attack. It was a demonstration of Ukraine's technological ingenuity. The Neptune, normally an anti-ship missile, had been secretly converted into a land attack weapon with a range of hundreds of kilometers. And that morning, 4 of these new weapons locked onto their targets simultaneously. This meant a total explosive power of 600 kilograms focused on a single point. This power was more than enough to shatter a steel-framed factory building, turn precision production lines into rubble, and create massive secondary explosions with the flammable chemicals inside. Distracted by the chaos in Belgorod and having deployed its most advanced air defense systems to the Ukrainian border, leaving its interior regions vulnerable, Russia was unable to respond to this low-flying and difficult-to-detect threat. When 4 Neptune missiles struck their targets with pinpoint accuracy, massive, successive explosions rocked the factory, and this destruction delivered one of the war's most ironic moments. The legendary Neptune missile that sent the Moskva cruiser to the bottom of the Black Sea was now in its land-to-land version, striking the home of its creators. Initial reports from local telegram channels and eyewitnesses described flames rising from the facility and black smoke covering the sky. But the most striking aspect was the moments of panic and escape from the factory and surrounding settlements. Those moments held one of the most tragic ironies of the war. For months, Elektrodetal workers had been producing the most critical parts of the missiles that would strike Ukrainian cities, hospitals, and homes. And now, as the revenge of those missiles destroyed their own factory in flames, they were fleeing for their lives. As the sirens wailed, the workers fleeing for their lives from the burning factory faced the vengeance of the weapons they had produced, striking Putin's war machine at its heart. The conversion of an anti-ship missile into a land attack cruise missile with a range of hundreds of kilometers was an incredible achievement for Ukraine's defense industry. This was a threat Russia had not anticipated. Just hearing the name of the weapon that sank the Moskva caused panic among the Russian command, and now knowing that this weapon could hit any target anywhere in Russia was a strategic nightmare for them. On the morning of September 29, 2025, the Ukrainian Navy and the General Staff of the Armed Forces claimed responsibility for the attack. In their official statements, they announced that Neptune cruise missiles had successfully struck the Karachevsky Elektrodetal facility in Russia's Bryansk region. The General Staff announced that 4 Neptune cruise missiles were launched from a distance of 240 kilometers. This confirmation had a sobering effect even on Russia's highest military command. The Russians thought Neptune could only hit ships. They were wrong. Neptune now hits everything. This two-stage operation left the Russian military command and propaganda machine in a state of complete helplessness. While the Russian Defense Ministry claimed to have shot down hundreds of UAVs, the factory in Bryansk being reduced to ashes and Belgorod being plunged into darkness rendered these claims meaningless. Russian media's attempt to portray the attack as a transformer malfunction collapsed within seconds, thanks to the massive fire detected in the region by NASA's FIRMS satellite system and geotagged videos taken by civilians. Propaganda had once again collided with and been crushed by the harsh reality on the ground. This operation also proved the failure of Russian air defense. 4 slow-flying cruise missiles striking a target hundreds of kilometers inside the border, bypassing Russia's much-touted layered air defense, demonstrated how inadequate these systems are. Putin's multi-billion-dollar air defense couldn't protect the brains of their own missiles. Russian air defense operators probably learned about the factory burning from local news. This successful attack showed that hundreds of other critical industrial facilities, command centers, and logistics depots within Russia are now within Ukraine's range and defenseless. This attack may only be the beginning. Ukraine has already announced that it has developed and tested a new version of the Neptune missile called Long Neptune, with a range of 1,000 kilometers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky personally announced that this variant had been tested in combat.
Пройшла успішно льотні випробування наша нова балістична ракета. Кожен може побачити, як спрацьовують і наші Нептуни.
A range of 1,000 kilometers means that Ukraine can hit almost any strategic target in European Russia, including Moscow, not just areas close to the border. While Russian generals clean up the wreckage in Bryansk, they now also have to check the plans for their shelters in Moscow. This new capability gives Ukraine not only retaliatory but also preemptive strike capabilities, forcing Russia to think twice when planning attacks on Ukraine. A new and dark era was beginning for Russia. Vladimir Zelensky directly warned Putin and Moscow about this in his statement on September 27th. The Russian Federation will get into trouble if it attacks Ukraine's energy sector. He had promised that in response to threats of power outages in Kiev, the Russians could implement power outages in Moscow. And that same night, Russia carried out one of its heaviest attacks on Ukraine. Looking at Zelensky's response and the Ukrainian army's choice of targets, we see that a new and truly dark era has begun for Russia. So, will Ukraine's attacks undermine the Russian people's support for the war? What could Putin do in retaliation? And where could Ukraine's next target be? These questions will be the most critical topics in the coming days. But one thing is certain. The war is now also an internal security issue for Russia. Russia may be forced to withdraw air defense systems from the front lines to protect critical facilities, which will further weaken the front line. First, they turned off the lights. Then they burned the factory. Ukraine is teaching Putin what fear feels like in his own home, in the most painful way possible. This was one of the most striking moments of the war, and the return of the ghost of Moscow was a turning point for Russia. Now Ukraine is bringing the war to Russia's economic heart, turning military attrition directly into an industrial and production crisis. Every factory hit destroys not only Russia's current war power, but also its future military capacity. This is a strategy that will drag the Russian economy into a long-term technological and industrial collapse. Any investment in a facility within Russia's defense industrial complex is now directly at risk of physical destruction. In the coming period, how Russia responds to these attacks will determine the course of the war. However, Putin's options are increasingly narrowing. He will either have to accept the chaos unfolding on his own soil and back down, or risk escalating further and triggering an uncontrollable catastrophe. In either case, Russia's adventure in Ukraine is poised to end in a far more painful and costly manner than anticipated. Because what happened on the nights of September 28th and 29th was not just a successful retaliatory operation, but also the announcement of a new and much more deadly phase in Ukraine's war doctrine. Strategic Attrition 2.0. This new strategy now aims not only to defeat the Russian army on the front lines, but to completely destroy the entire system that sustains that army, namely, Russia's economic, industrial, and most importantly, psychological resilience. The main fuse lit in Belgorod and the missile artery severed in Bryansk were only the first steps of this new and ruthless doctrine. So, what will the next steps of this strategy be? And how will these steps drag the Russian army, its people, and ultimately Putin's power into a vortex? Ukraine's next offensive strategy will attack Russia's different vulnerabilities simultaneously, like a three-headed dragon. This is a multi-layered strangulation operation that Russia cannot fully cope with, either militarily or politically. The dragon's first head will target the money taps that feed Russia's war machine. Attacks on the oil terminal in Tuapse or the military factory in Bryansk were just the beginning of this strategy. In the future, Ukraine's long-range UAVs and missiles will systematically target all of the critical economic infrastructure Russia uses to evade Western sanctions. These targets include oil and gas pipelines stretching from Siberia to China, LNG terminals in the Far East, railway bridges, and ports exporting Russia's valuable minerals such as nickel and aluminum. Each successful attack will reduce the foreign currency entering the Kremlin's coffers, increase the budget deficit, and make financing the war increasingly impossible with each passing day. The dragon's second head will directly target the Russian army's capacity to fight. This includes not only the troops on the front lines, but also the entire back-end system that manages, feeds, and arms those troops. Future attacks will intensify on munitions factories, tank repair facilities, military airfields, and most importantly, the command and control centers where generals direct the war, deep within Russia. The goal is to gradually paralyze the Russian army by leaving it leaderless, unarmed, and without supplies. When an army's safe rear areas become death traps, its will to fight disappears. The most insidious and perhaps most effective head of the dragon will directly target the Russian people's psychology and patience. The attack on the thermal power plant in Belgorod and the factory in Bryansk were demonstrations of how ruthless this strategy can be. In the future, targets that directly affect civilian life, but also have military logic, will be prioritized. Attacks on targets such as electricity and water infrastructure, communication towers, and railway networks will plunge the Russian people's daily lives into chaos. The goal is to completely tear up the stability and security contract Putin has offered his own people, and bring the true cost of war into every home in Russia in the most painful way possible. The combined effects of this three-pronged strategy on Russia have the potential to grow like an avalanche, engulfing the entire system with each passing day. The impact of this strategy on the Russian army. When military paralysis and economic strangulation strategies are combined, a complete nightmare scenario emerges for the Russian army. Units already suffering from morale and equipment shortages at the front will see their logistical support and production chain systematically destroyed behind them. Fuel will not arrive, ammunition will run out, damaged tanks will not be repaired. At the same time, commanders will be forced to constantly relocate, unable to establish effective command and control. This situation will cause desertion rates to skyrocket, increase acts of insubordination, and irreversibly destroy the army's overall combat capability within a few months. Russia may still have millions of soldiers on paper, but it will no longer have the power to fight on the ground. The impact on the Russian people and economy will now be paid for not only with the lives of the young men sent to the front, but also with the quality of life of the millions left behind at home. Constant power and water outages, empty supermarket shelves, soaring inflation, and fuel shortages will create an environment of social misery reminiscent of the chaotic years of the 1990s in Russia. The lies of propaganda will be completely ineffective in the face of this concrete reality. The people's anger will first be directed at local officials, then at governors, and finally directly at the Kremlin, that is, Vladimir Putin. This will maximize the risk of an uncontrollable social explosion, which is the regime's greatest fear. The Russian economy, meanwhile, will go into freefall under this double pressure. Western sanctions on one side and Ukraine's infrastructure attacks on the other. When all these effects combine, the real target, Vladimir Putin's power, will be under greater threat than ever before. Putin's legitimacy was built on two fundamental promises to his people: stability and strength. Ukraine's new strategy is destroying both of these promises simultaneously. The chaos within the country, power outages, and economic misery are turning the promise of stability into a lie. The army's impotence at the front and the inability to protect even targets in the heart of the motherland are shattering the image of a strong Russia. In this situation, Putin has nothing left to offer his people. This is also an existential crisis for the elites within the Kremlin. The oligarchs, generals, and bureaucrats who have rallied around Putin for years remained loyal to him as long as he provided them with prosperity and security. But now, Putin's war has begun to threaten their wealth, their security, and even their lives. In this situation, the elites will begin to ask themselves, is Putin still a leader who protects our interests, or is he a burden who will drag us all down with him? This question could mark the beginning of a palace coup, or a process in which Putin is quietly persuaded to retire. Ultimately, Ukraine's new strategy has transformed the war from a military conflict into a regime survival crisis for Putin's regime. Putin must now fight not only to defeat Ukraine, but also to preserve his own power. And in this new equation, his options are narrowing by the day. He will either have to escalate the war, resorting to unpredictable and potentially catastrophic measures such as nuclear threats, or he will be forced to retreat, accepting a humiliating defeat under pressure from his own people and elites. In either case, this strategic war of attrition initiated by Ukraine signals the beginning of the end of Putin's 25-year rule. What do you think? Will Ukraine's clever strategy change the course of the war? Will Russia be able to extinguish this fire that started on its own soil? And when the long Neptune missiles enter the scene, what will Moscow do? Share your valuable opinions and analyses with us in the comments section. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like this video to support our independent analyses.